All right, this is exam 4 review. Hopefully this will help you understand the material even better than ever. So if you know these cases, you'll be in great shape for the exam, and if you know the subject matter, you'll be even better in better shape. So FE stands for free exercise, EC stands for equal protection. Those are both the First Amendment set of cases. We also have S, that stands for speech, also First Amendment. Due process. Due process is one of the civil liberties that we have. And P stands for privacy, which is not listed in any specific amendment, but it is found throughout the Bill of Rights. Those are all the civil liberties. On the other side, you see EP stands for equal protection. That's cases based on the Equal Protection Clause, and that's what our civil rights are based upon. So those are the cases that you need to know for this exam. When you're answering a question, your essay question, be sure to apply any appropriate tests, for example, the compelling interest test, and then use the cases that are appropriate. That's what I'm looking for. Here's an example. City of McAlester decides that they want to build a church right next to City Hall because employees enjoy praying on their lunch breaks. Are they allowed to spend city money to build the church? Which cases should you be thinking about? You can go at this in two different ways. The free exercise clause, meaning the employees have a right to worship on their lunch breaks, or you could also look at the establishment clause. So if you're going to use the establishment clause, you think about whether or not it looks like the city is establishing a state religion by spending money to support one faith over another faith. So if it's establishment, definitely want to look at whether the wall of separation is being breached, similar to the way that it was discussed in the Everson case. So this is what we're looking for. I want you to talk about the cases. If you have written your essay question and you have not mentioned a case by name, you are not going to get full credit. That's what I'm looking for on the essay question in this exam. Okay, first area, civil liberties. We're looking at the Bill of Rights, first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Remember, the Bill of Rights were written to restrain what the federal government could and couldn't do. It didn't have anything to do with the states. Therefore, we have a need for the doctrine of selective incorporation, where the Bill of Rights have been incorporated against the states over the last 200 years. It's been a long process, and even today, not all of the rights have been incorporated against the states. Why is that important? Because it's the states who are actually more likely to violate our rights, more so than the federal government. Therefore, we need more protection from the states. Generally, we have fundamental freedoms: right to speech, right to worship, right to privacy, right to due process. Except if the government has a compelling reason or a compelling interest in abridging or violating our rights. So Congress, under the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech, yet we can think of a lot of compelling reasons why Congress can abridge our right to free speech. For example, if we want to shout fire in a crowded theater, that's not allowed. If we want to lie about people, that's not allowed. So some speech is protected, and then the government has a compelling interest in limiting other forms of speech. The word compelling is a magic word. It's very likely that this will be applicable in your essay question, that you're using the compelling interest test, because we see it in so many areas of the law. Okay, so in the First Amendment, we start with freedom of religion and freedom of speech. We're going to start with freedom of religion. We have two separate parts. Free Exercise Clause gives individuals the right to exercise their religion. The Amish may educate their children. Members of the Santeria faith may sacrifice animals. Children at school may pray on their lunch hour. Like, these are rights that all people have, that the government will not step in their right to exercise their religion freely. So on the one hand, you have the Wisconsin versus Yoder case, which were the Amish who wanted to educate their own children. The Supreme Court said the state of Wisconsin had no compelling interest in forcing this, and forcing the children to go to a public school instead of private schools. Therefore, the Amish won the right to freely exercise their religion and educate their own children. We also have, on the other hand, a case where the Supreme Court ruled against the free exercise of religion. Members of Native American Church wanted to smoke peyote without legal consequence, but the Supreme Court said no. So they put that right on the scales, and they said the right to free exercise does not outweigh the compelling interest the state has in regulating illegal drugs. So in the Wisconsin versus Yoder case, they weighed the state's desire to educate these children, and the Amish showed how unnecessary that was. Therefore, the compelling interest test was not met. But in Smith, the compelling interest test was met, and the state of Oregon was allowed to continue to regulate drugs such as peyote. All right, the second set of cases are Establishment Clause. If you're talking about prayer in school, if you're talking about a public governmental office celebrating a religious tradition, you're talking about whether or not the government is actually establishing a religion. They're privileging one religion over another, or even the idea of religion over irreligion, which is also not allowed. Two cases on the Establishment Clause. The case Everson is important because it gives us the phrase wall of separation between church and state. We keep our religion in our church, and we keep our politics in our government, and they say there must be a wall of separation between church and state. In that case, in the Everson case, a group of people challenged a local school district busing Catholic school children to school. And they said, although there must be a wall of separation between churches and state, this particular action does not violate the wall of separation between church and state, and therefore the kids could continue to be bused. Another thing they said in that case was, a fire department doesn't look to see if it's a church they've been called to. They put out the fire. They serve the public first before they look at who it is that they're serving. And then the Ingalls versus Vitale case, 1962, that's the year the Supreme Court said that praying in school or prayer in school violates the Establishment Clause of the U.S. Constitution because it appears that the public schools and the government is supporting a specific religion over another religion, typically Christianity. So they banned prayer in school, teacher-led prayer in school, starting back in 1962. So, surprise, it was illegal. Next we're moving on to, let's see. Hold on, I'm trying to make sure I'm not skipping anything. Okay, next we're moving on to freedom of speech. The concept of the marketplace of ideas, where we want everything to get out in the open. Also, political speech is a fundamental right, and then some forms of speech are not protected at all. Okay, let me explain these things a little bit. Here's an example of something I saw on Facebook. This was a while ago. And he said, the best thing about social media is that it brings people's ignorance and hate to the surface. That's totally the point I'm trying to make about marketplace of ideas. If somebody's got a stupid idea in their head, it's much better for society if that person voices it in public and someone else says, hey, you know how stupid you are? That's a dumb idea. And maybe they'll change their mind. If you have a terrible idea in your head and you don't say it out loud, then there's no chance it'll ever be argued with. So I actually think it's better for people to say dumb stuff in hopes that their mind will be changed in the future. Okay, and also political speech is the most important form of speech. Why is that? Well, if you're living in a democracy, information and freedom of thought are so important. And if people feel like they cannot speak freely about political things, then we might as well not have a democracy. So political speech is extremely important. In fact, let me skip ahead to the next slide. Look at this. 3 levels of speech. Political speech, super highly protected. It's a fundamental right. Examples include both cases, the Cohen case and the Tinker case. At the bottom level, we have speech that's not protected at all. Libel, which is telling lies about people. Obscenity, which is just stuff that has no redeeming artistic value, like pornography. So like a sculpture of the David by Michelangelo is art, but a picture of a naked dude is pornography. So if it has no artistic value, it's obscenity, and there's no protection for this kind of speech. Finally, normal speech, like just conversations or advertising, it's somewhat protected, but not to the level of political speech. I'll come back to this idea in a minute. So California versus Cohen is the jean jacket case where the guy had F the draft written on the back of his jean jacket. Supreme Court looked at the compelling interest the state had in silencing the speech, and they found that there was no state interest in silencing the jean jacket, so he was allowed to have that message. But if it had just said the F word with no other political context, then he would not have had that right. So that's the difference between normal speech and political speech, because political speech is much more highly protected. Tinker, this is a picture of the little kids in their armbands, and they were allowed to wear the armbands because there was no compelling state interest that the school had in silencing the speech that they had when they were using the armband, symbolic speech, to make a statement about protesting the Vietnam War. All right, so coming back here, so the point I wanted to make about the Cohen case is, so if it says F the draft, it's political speech, but if it just says F your mama or F something else, it's not political, then it's under the second category and it's not protected. Picture this scales. Now this scales is also on your review sheet, and you should think about it because a lot of the time the Supreme Court is using some kind of balancing test or weighing test. And so on one side of the scales you see the compelling state interest. Why is the government trying to interfere with our fundamental right? And on the other side we have our right to say or do what it is we want to do. So if we think about political speech, examples include stating your opinion, like I want this candidate to win, or criticizing the government. I think they've made a terrible mistake. Like those are good things in a democracy because it helps us be better. So why would the government want to shut us down? Well, let's say it's national security. If I would not be allowed to say where we are hiding super secret military gear. I could say, I think the military is making a terrible mistake here, but I can't say, located at this location is all of our stuff. Now don't go get it. Preventing a riot, so if things are getting out of hand, they can silence speech. This is not an American example, but recently in Paris, they were having a big climate summit on the global warming, and the government of France actually shut down all the protesters because they were so worried about the security of all the heads of state who were there. Now, same thing happens in the United States frequently, where the right to have a protest, which is usually highly protected, is shut down because of the fear of some terrible ill, which the government has a right to protect. And then there's a Supreme Court case, the Pentagon Papers case, where basically the government said, or the Supreme Court said, you can publish anything you want to about the government, but you can't put the lives of American troops in harm's way. For example, you can't tell where the gunboats at sea are that might cause sailors to be killed. So since the government is just made up of people, they try to shut down political speech all the time. So those are good reasons to shut down political speech. Bad reasons include, like, we're embarrassed with what we did, or we disagree with you. Like, those are not legitimate, compelling interests in shutting down political speech. So if you're criticizing the government and you're telling how stupid it is, and they just don't like it because they're mad at you, that's not good enough. There has to be a real reason that they've silenced your speech. So just keep in mind the balancing test. That's why these cases are so interesting, because the facts of the case can determine the outcome. It's not a really clear thing. That's why we have a court and not a computer that's making these decisions. Okay, so look at the flag burning, Texas versus Johnson. Johnson burned a flag. He was charged with Texas's the Flag Desecration Act, where you can't desecrate the flag or burn the flag. And he challenged that, saying under the First Amendment he had a right to burn the flag. So on the one hand, he's saying, I have this strong free speech interest. What's the compelling interest that the government has in keeping me from burning the flag? And they basically said, well, we don't like it. And the Supreme Court said, well, that's not good enough. You haven't given us a good enough compelling interest in not burning the flag. So flag burning is legal, cannot be banned. Awesome case. Like these kids are at school and they get on TV and they put up this huge sign that says "Bong hits for Jesus," and the question is whether or not their speech is protected. Well, if you think about this, "Bong hits for Jesus" is what their sign said. It doesn't really say anything particularly political, and therefore they were not allowed the right to have this speech. So if you think about Tinker, yes, the children should have a right to free speech if they want to make a political message, so their right to speech should be protected, but then you look at this message and you say, well, it's not very political. So although they do have limited speech rights at school, this particular message does not meet the standard because it's not political speech. And so this is an actual case called Morse versus Frederick. All right, so now rights of the accused, we have the rights of due process. The government must give us due process unless there's a compelling state interest in not doing so. For example, if they think there's a bomb in your house, they can run into your house and look for the bomb without having a warrant or anything else. So even these rights can be compromised if there's a compelling state interest. So the MAP case is the case that incorporated the exclusionary rule against the states. What's the exclusionary rule? It's the rule that says that if evidence is improperly seized, it cannot be used in a court of law against the defendant. Therefore, this picture, this Dollaré map, they went into her house, they improperly seized evidence, they tried to use it in court against her, and she said, no, that's not right. The exclusionary rule had been used before in federal court, but it had never been incorporated into state law, and so the MAP case is famous because it incorporates the exclusionary rule against the states. The Fifth Amendment is the right to remain silent. The Miranda right that we all have is one of the most famous rights, and it came about because a man was forced to incriminate himself in court. He's sitting in jail, he's looking at his prosecution, and he's thinking, well, I had the right against self-incrimination. Why did they make me tell what I had done? And so he appealed to the Supreme Court, saying he should have not had to testify against himself, basically. And the Supreme Court agreed, and they said that all criminal defendants now need to be told they don't have to speak. They have a right to remain silent, because if they talk, that information will be used against them. They never said that before. So until the 60s, it was commonplace to just interrogate a defendant, and then they would use whatever the defendant said against the defendant, which is against what the Fifth Amendment says. So incorporation is a big deal in criminal law because very little of federal law, criminal law is federal, which is where the Bill of Rights originally protects. And so you need this funnel to bring down the rights that we have in the Bill of Rights to the states. What comprises the funnel? The 14th Amendment and the word state, where it says, no state shall abridge people's due process of law. Okay. 8th Amendment, punishments for crime may not be cruel and unusual. Yes. Okay, most of the rights of the accused were incorporated during the Warren Court. So Earl Warren is a big deal in this unit. He incorporated the rights of the accused against the states. He was the Chief Justice during the privacy cases, starting with the Griswold case in 1965, and then he was also the Chief Justice during the Brown decisions. So this revolution that we experienced in the United States for civil rights and civil liberties, it's all due to Chief Justice Earl Warren. So he's probably the person who has shaped your life more than anyone that you never knew even happened. Because whether it's a civil rights issue or the police, how the police act, or what kinds of things you can say, it is all determined by what happened during the Warren Court. Okay, so now we move to privacy, another Warren area of jurisprudence. First privacy case is in 1965, Griswold versus Connecticut. The issue here is contraception. Can a married couple buy contraception devices so that they don't get pregnant? That was illegal under Connecticut law. But the Supreme Court struck down Connecticut's law, saying the state did not have a compelling interest in controlling people's reproductive choices, that was outweighed by the right to privacy. So everyone's like, privacy? Where does privacy come in the Bill of Rights? It doesn't exist. But if you look, according to Justice Douglas, who wrote the opinion, if you look at the First, Third, Fourth, Fifth, and Ninth Amendments, the penumbra of privacy emanates from these sections of the Bill of Rights. Therefore, we now have a fundamental right to privacy that can't be abridged unless the government has a compelling interest. So then we move to Roe versus Wade. Similar to Griswold, the woman wants to get an abortion. She says if they can buy contraception under their right to privacy, my right to privacy should include the right to get an abortion. Supreme Court agreed, and in 1973 it became a fundamental right that women have a right to choose to have an abortion in this country. And then other people tried to expand these reproductive or adult privacy issues into the area of sodomy. So basically, 2 men were caught in the flagrante delicto in 1986, and they alleged that the right to privacy should extend to them. At this point, the Supreme Court ruled that they were wrong. So privacy did not extend to them, and the state of Georgia, which is where the Kat Bowers case came from, had a right to regulate adult sexual activity under their, the important state interest of regulating the moral code. So Georgia could regulate its own moral code, and that outweighed the privacy right that Bowers had. So the next case that comes up is the same basic case, except for instead of Georgia, it's Texas. 2 dudes here, you can see them in the picture, were caught together in flagrante delicto, and they said that they had a right to privacy. They should be able to engage in adult consensual sexual activity, and the Supreme Court said yes. They overturned Bowers exactly, and they said that Texas's right to regulate its own moral code did not supersede the right of Lawrence and Garner to engage in adult activity. So we see a gradual expansion of the right of privacy starting in 1965 and expanding through 2003. So if the government's going to shut down our right to privacy, they must have a compelling state interest to do so. They can't just do it for no reason. Okay, so now we're moving to the issue of civil rights. Civil rights shows us the rights that we have that are more of a positive right. So we get our rights from the 14th Amendment. If you see this slide, it's important for 2 areas here. Both the state may not deprive us of due process of law, which is our civil liberties, and then the equal protection of the laws. So we cannot treat people who are the same differently. It is against the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment is part of the Civil War Amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, which were written to ensure equality for the slaves who had been freed as a result of the events of the Civil War. Okay, so you should know the difference between de jure versus de facto segregation. De jure is there's a law mandating segregation. De facto just means people have chosen to live in certain areas, people have chosen to work at certain firms, but it's not mandated by law. I would argue that it's actually harder to get rid of de facto segregation than de jure. Because de jure, you can erase a law, but once the law is gone, you still have the same housing patterns and the same employment patterns, and it's harder to eradicate de facto segregation. So a few years ago, a woman named Pat Bush visited ECU to talk about how she attended all black schools in Ada. Later, when her family got to choose whether she attended the black school or the white school, they actually chose to go to the white school. So if you think about this, does this demonstrate de jure or de facto segregation? Well, when she was a part of an all-black school district, a segregated school district, that is de jure. When segregation by law is gone and they get to pick the school they go to, they might have picked the black school. And then she still would have been in an all-black environment, but it would have been de facto. So that's the difference between de facto and de jure. Is it by law? Is it by policy? Okay, 3 movements of civil rights. Movement of the court starts with the NAACP filing lawsuits to try to achieve integration. You have to understand the Plessy case to understand what's going on in these other cases. So Plessy says separate but equal is constitutional under the 14th Amendment. Therefore, we can have Jim Crow. There can be separate trains for blacks and whites. You can have segregated eating facilities. Everything is segregated by race. So this began to erode. And one of the important cases that helped to erode was the Scipio case, which was an Oklahoma case, where a black woman argued that she should have the right to go to the black law school. She said, okay, or excuse me, OU Law School. She said, let me into OU Law School. I would love to go to the black law school, but it seems as there is not a black law school, you've got to let me into the white law school. And so that's eventually what happened. She was allowed admittance into OU Law School, and she was the first black person to go. So Brown builds on Scipio. Brown is the opposite of Plessy. Brown overturns Plessy. Plessy said separate but equal is constitutional. Brown said separate but equal is unconstitutional. Putting children in separate school districts, separate schools, and separate school systems harms the black children, harms their self-esteem. Therefore, it is unconstitutional. So that 1954 is the beginning of the end of segregation in the United States. That leads us to movement into the streets. Brown has decided in 1954. 1 year later, and actually this happened this week, 60 years ago, Rosa Parks refused to get up out of her seat on a bus. The Montgomery bus boycott, which began in 1955, which was led by Martin Luther King Jr., gives us 3 examples of strategies of civil rights change. Civil disobedience, which is failure to follow a law and then paying the consequences in order to show how unjust the law is. Rosa Parks did that when she didn't move out of the bus and got arrested. Nonviolence. So when the police attack rallies with clubs and dogs and people didn't fight back, they let themselves be clubbed and they let themselves be harmed. That's exemplifying nonviolence. And then economic boycott, which is when all the black people in Montgomery, Alabama refused to ride that bus for over a year. They withheld their money from the bus system, and the bus system almost went bankrupt, and they were forced to change the policy and let the blacks not be segregated on the buses. And so the economic boycott forced the bus system to agree with what the blacks were protesting for. So those 3 strategies are shown in the bus boycott. So you should know Clara Luper, who was the first integrationist in Oklahoma City, and integrated the lunch counters in Oklahoma City. And then Martin Luther King Jr.'s March on Washington showed a large group of black people protesting peacefully. The I Have a Dream speech galvanized America, not just black America, but white America too, and really showed people that they had nothing to fear by supporting civil rights. And so all of this leads to the movement in Congress. One important thing about this is you should know that President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. Kennedy wanted to push civil rights, but he didn't get very far. When Johnson took office in 1963, he said, we need to pass a civil rights bill in honor of President Kennedy, and that's what happened. Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed to honor President Kennedy. It said no discrimination in public accommodation. A public accommodation would be a restaurant, a hotel, a swimming pool, a store, anywhere where the public is welcome is a public accommodation, and now you can no longer segregate your stores. So the Civil Rights Act changed how the public interacted in 1964 in a commercial way. The Voting Rights Act attacked the fact that many black people were not allowed to vote in the South. Basically between 1876, which was the end of the Reconstruction era after the Civil War, and 1965. So almost 100 years, the black people were prevented from voting. Voting Rights Act federalized voter registration and voter, like the actual polling places. The federal government came in and ran those things because the state was being so discriminatory in the way they were doing it. So the federal government came in and took over. So in summary, you should think about which movement is most important, and I think you'll come to the conclusion that if we didn't have all three, we wouldn't be where we are today in terms of getting rid of the laws that segregated our society. So think about that. In summary, here's what will help you on the exam. If you know the incorporation doctrine, if you can define it, so practice in terms of a short answer question on the incorporation doctrine. You need to know the compelling interest test, so it'll probably help you on the essay question. And then you need to know these cases. All of these cases are fair game for short answer questions. I would make note cards, write the name of the case on the front, and on the back write what kind of case it is and just a word or two about what it was to help you remember. If you know all of these, you'll be in great shape on the exam. So good luck, and let me know if you have any questions.